While West Belfast may be most well known for its Irish Republican history, that is far from the whole story. With the Loyalist Ulster Defence Association and Ulster Volunteer Force emerging from the Shankill Road area of West Belfast as the Troubles began. An economically deprived but culturally rich 1.5-mile stretch with a violent, troubled, and complex history. The Shankill Road has been traditionally split along Loyalist paramilitary lines, with the U.D.A, UVF, and UVF affiliate Red Hand Commando all laying claim to various sections of the highly built-up district during the 30-year conflict. And unlike the Provisional IRA and the Republican politics of Sinn Féin, Loyalist paramilitaries have always been much more distanced from the mainstream political unionism that represented them at the highest level. So while Sinn Féin's inclusion in the peace process gave the Provos strong incentive to wind down, armed loyalism did no such thing, with violent internal feuds and grisly murders lasting throughout the 2000s as the UVF and U.D.A morphed from so-called freedom fighters into criminal gangs, profiting under the guise of politics. But while they now only fought each other, the U.D.A and UVF still shared one thing: the Shankill Road, with the UVF's 1st Battalion West Belfast, comprised of A Company Shankill, B Company Woodvale, and C Company, sometimes called S Company, Spring Martin, Highfield, and Glenkern, while the West Belfast UDA went the opposite direction, with A Company, Glenkern, Highfield, and Spring Martin, B Company Woodvale, and the infamous C Company of the Lower Shankill. But as the 2000s became the 2010s, it became clear the police service of Northern Ireland was unequipped to handle the out-of-control gangland activities of Loyalist paramilitaries by themselves, as the groups continued to murder their own, peddle drugs, extort, and loan shark the working-class Protestant areas they once claimed to protect. So in November 2017, the Paramilitary Crime Task Force was introduced across the province, dedicated solely to stopping the gangland activities of paramilitaries on both sides of the divide. And its intentions were clear: follow the money and find the drugs. In December 2019, the Paramilitary Crime Task Force arrested U.D.A C Company commander and community worker Mo Courtney, as well as C Company vet and community worker Dennis Cunningham, on suspicion of money laundering as part of its investigation into the Lower Shankill Community Association, a charitable organization that had raked in more than £1 million in government funding over the past decade, with heavy links to the West Belfast UDA. Police seized cash and a car from the homes of Courtney and Cunningham, as both were taken into custody, something both knew well, with Courtney serving an 8-year sentence for his role in the 2003 murder of Loyalist Alan McCullough, and Cunningham being caged for 2.5 years in 2005 after reading out a U.D.A statement on camera while wearing his distinctive glasses over a balaclava. But while both men would avoid prison for the 2019 raids, Courtney's C Company was now regarded by police as the biggest organized drugs gang in the city, with the cops becoming increasingly worried about the wider criminal activities of the U.D.A in West Belfast. And with the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement just 3 years away, the gangland activities within the U.D.A and UVF were an embarrassment to many, and action needed to be taken. 2 months later, in February 2020, the Archbishop of Canterbury, alongside high-ranking officials within the British government and MI5, met top loyalists at the Archbishop's Lambeth Palace home in London, with the UVF being represented by men like Chief of Staff John Bunter Graham, as well as A Company commander and community worker Harry Stockman. The U.D.A, which unlike the UVF no longer had a central command, was also represented by men like South Belfast Brigadier and community worker Jackie MacDonald, but were largely sidelined due to the wider organization's rampant criminality in places like West Belfast. The Lambeth Summit was a call to action, with British intelligence wanting to know what it would take for the UVF and U.D.A. to wind down as criminal organizations and nudge its members towards their various charitable affiliates that received regular government funding. But in return for unwinding their multi-million-pound crime networks, the Loyalist leaders made their demands very clear. They wanted more funding for their charitable affiliates, and they wanted an end to historic prosecutions, ranging from crimes committed at the beginning of the Troubles in 1969 till the murder of Loyalist Bobby Moffat on the Shankill Road in 2010. And the message back was just as plain. If you want an end to historic prosecutions, while also receiving government aid, you better get your house in order first.
It's not about protecting their community. They use that as a flag of convenience to maintain their legitimacy and to claim a reason, if there ever was one, for them to continue to exist. But people should be under no illusions. These groups are out to serve themselves and they don't care about the community.
In 2019, Mo Courtney's former second-in-command, drug dealer Dee Coleman, returned to the Shankill Road, following a short stint in prison for U.D.A. membership. The 33-year-old Coleman, who was first jailed as a 14-year-old for firing a gun at the UVF's Rex bar during the Loyalist feud of 2000, had grown up into a feared, drug-dealing gangster within the Lower Shankill's Shankill estate. Coleman's recent stint in prison was welcomed by many in the old-school U.D.A., who saw him as a wrecking ball. And while he was locked up, Mo Courtney replaced Coleman with Dee Jenkins, who had worked for Coleman prior to his 2018 arrest, and would now be taking over his former boss's role as C Company's second-in-command. So when Coleman returned from prison, a feud was imminent. But while Coleman tried to take back his rackets, the U.D.A. continued to back Jenkins. That meant Coleman was now dealing without the U.D.A.'s permission, and was quickly ordered to pay a £10,000 fine or take a kneecapping. But while Coleman supposedly paid the fine and was allowed to keep selling drugs, he continued to blame Jenkins for his downfall, a dispute that would reach its crescendo 1 year later. In October 2020, Dee Jenkins was arrested by the paramilitary crime task force and charged with supplying cocaine and cannabis. And while he was bailed to await trial, Jenkins' headline arrest was seen as a major embarrassment for the U.D.A.'s Shankill Road leadership, making him just as toxic as Coleman in the eyes of many. In February 2021, a lone gunman fired multiple shots at a male standing at the rear of Jenkins' Shankill estate home, when the seriously injured man was in fact just one of Jenkins' friends. Hours later, a gloating Coleman was photographed on social media clutching a bottle of champagne, not knowing his alleged shooter had got the wrong guy. A U.D.A. gang would then smash up Coleman's Shankill estate home. But the drug dealer had already fled to the town of Ballymena. And while he had missed a murder bid through sheer luck, Dee Jenkins was far from relieved. The West Belfast UDA was highly suspicious of his October 2020 arrest and subsequent £500 bail on serious drug charges. So following the murder attempt by Coleman and fear of another by the UDA, the 40-year-old Jenkins fled the Shankill in March 2021 for a new life in England while he awaited trial. Jenkins would eventually be sentenced to 2 years in 2022, while Coleman would also be remanded as he faced a separate, brutal kidnapping and attempted murder charge after allegedly stabbing a man who owed him money with a hot knife, smashing the man's head with a hatchet, and leaving him to die in a field outside Ballymena in October 2021. Unfortunately for Coleman, the man survived, but incurred life-changing injuries. And while back on the Shankill, relieved residents were delighted to see both Jenkins and Coleman gone. The area's drug problem was still every bit as bad. While the Shankill UVF had largely moved against drug dealing within its ranks, the West Belfast UDA had not. And given recent events on the Lower Shankill, the West Belfast UDA was in a tough spot. Because while they were technically an independent gang, They were holding back funding opportunities for regular people who worked for and used community centers up and down the Shankill Road. A Company was not a problem under the command of anti-drug Eric McKee, while the Lower Shankill C Company was an absolute mess under the rule of crime boss Mo Courtney. But in the middle of the two was Woodvale, a neighborhood historically divided between the U.D.A. and UVF. While the day-to-day of U.D.A. B Company was supposedly run by Mo Courtney's cousin Geordie, the most infamous U.D.A. man to come from the area was Jim Spence, a feared Loyalist operator who was hated by many and respected by more. Spence, who has been heavily linked to the murder of Republican lawyer Pat Finucane in 1989, would have been a top target for the IRA. But with a little help from Special Branch, Jim Spence managed to survive the Troubles, and in the aftermath, supposedly built one of the most prolific drug-dealing operations in the greater Belfast area, with a network covering Woodvale, the Upper Shankill, Ballysillin, Tigers Bay, and Antrim further north. But in early 2021, a major shakeup was reported within the ranks of U.D.A. B Company, with Spence himself allegedly being stood down from the organization. But while news reports spoke of Spence being forced out, I would have a very tough time believing that. Jim Spence was not someone you told what to do. He had survived the IRA, feuds with Johnny Adair, and being heavily suspected as a police informer. Jim Spence, for better or worse, was a Loyalist untouchable. He was a former West Belfast brigadier who never cared about notoriety or rank, and always kept things moving behind the scenes. In the eyes of some, Spence would have been the most feared man on the Shankill Road, and if he was going to stand down, it would be on his own terms. But by 2021, he was a multimillionaire in his 60s, and with the paramilitary crime task force now breathing down his neck, this would have been a more than sensible time for an early retirement. But while Spence was never a dealer himself, he built a wide-ranging operation, and stepping back from that would not be some overnight phenomenon. But it was nevertheless now known Spence planned to stand down, and while that should be taken with a grain of salt, it was big news within paramilitary circles. Men like West Belfast Brigadier Matt Kincaid knew that drug dealing on the Shankill wasn't going to stop. So if the West Belfast UDA could be seen as getting rid of men like Spence and saying it was just a C Company, Mo Courtney problem, the brigade could be perceived as trying to get rid of drug dealers while continuing to profit off them at the same time. But by now, the Mo Courtney problem had grown far beyond the Lower Shankill. In October 2022, East Belfast UVF affiliated drug dealer Jerry Verner was asked by the Dublin gang who supplied him cocaine if there was anyone who could hold a few handguns for them in Belfast. So Verner put an addict he dealt to in touch with the Dublin boys, knowing the man could be easily threatened into storing the guns and would be too scared to go to the police. But the addict was also a low-ranking member of the West Belfast UDA, and when Mo Courtney found out he was storing the weapons, the C Company boss sent his second-in-command, the man who replaced Dee Jenkins, to trade the addict a large amount of cocaine for the guns. So when Verner and the Dublin crew went looking for the weapons, they found the addict empty-handed and tortured the man until he admitted who the real thief was. And after sending Mo Courtney images of the battered C Company foot soldier, the Dublin gang took a trip out west. The southern mobsters went cruising along the Shankill Road in search of their handguns, and allegedly approached C Company's Dennis Cunningham as he locked up the Lower Shankill Community Association office in search of Mo Courtney. But Courtney, who lived in North Belfast, was nowhere to be found, and knowing they would need more backup, the Dublin men headed home. fearing a larger cross-border dispute and a potential feud between the West Belfast UDA and the East Belfast UVF, who Jerry Verner was linked to. The police quickly raided Courtney's home in the Forth River area, as well as that of his second-in-command, looking for the guns. However, both searches failed to uncover any weapons. But the messy incident rattled UDA leadership, who got in touch with the Dublin gang, telling them Courtney and his number 2 had acted completely on their own. And because they did, the UDA would not be helping the gang get back its guns. The ball was in Dublin's court, and Mo Courtney wasn't budging. The aging Loyalist gunman turned criminal godfather had survived countless feuds and was directly involved in at least 2 murders. So if there was to be war, he wasn't going anywhere. And to show everyone the old dog was still top dog, the 60-year-old Courtney sent out a warning shot much closer to home. In late 2022, 62-year-old Jim Spence was still profiting off the drug-dealing network he had helped build. And while he was no longer technically in the U.D.A., many of his dealers still were. And with the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement months away, Westminster and MI5 were turning up the heat. And while the West Belfast UVF was largely focused on getting its drug-affiliated East Belfast Battalion in order, it increasingly began to feel like any efforts by the West Belfast UDA to do the same were strictly for show. Months later, on the 27th of January 2023, the Berlin Bar on the Shankill Road, owned by Spence's daughter Becky, was attacked by 20 masked men on the orders of Mo Courtney. Shortly after 7 p.m., the mob, armed with baseball bats and hammers, entered the iconic Shankill pub and ordered everyone out. The C Company crew then went on a half-hour wrecking spree, smashing everything in the bar to pieces. The incident was a direct message to Becky's drug-dealing husband, Mark Pollock, a former Red Hand commando who used the Berlin Bar to sell drugs. Pollock, who for a time would have fallen under the wing of his father-in-law, Jim Spence, was now a major dealer in his own right. And if Mo Courtney wanted a fight, he was going to punch back. Pollock, who didn't take the attack lightly, sent a gang of his own to burn down an office connected to the Lower Shankill Community Association a few days later. However, the blaze died out before it could do any permanent damage. But a line had been crossed. Up until this point, the feud between Mark Pollock and Mo Courtney appeared to be personal, with an unclear but undeniable connection to Jim Spence. But an attack on an unofficial U.D.A. headquarters was different, with Spence wanting no part of it, and the entire West Belfast Brigade now backing Courtney. And Courtney's demands were clear. If the feud with Pollock was to end, the Berlin Bar must remain shut. Knowing more attacks would make life unbearable for Becky Spence, the Berlin Bar shut its doors in the aftermath. And seeing an opportunity to get out before things got truly messy, Jim Spence stepped further back from the drug-dealing network he created. But while Mo Courtney thought he would be the man to fill the void, that remained to be seen. As Courtney's drug debts increased to his Kinahan-linked suppliers, and his behavior became increasingly erratic throughout 2023. But while an attack on Courtney's crew from within the U.D.A. was never going to happen, they couldn't protect his men from the UVF. In January 2024, one of Mo Courtney's top men was at home in Woodvale when a masked UVF gang forced their way inside. The C Company man was defenseless, as he was savagely assaulted with baseball bats and iron bars. It's unclear what preceded the assault, but it was a very direct message. And it wasn't just coming from the UVF. 4 years earlier, the West Belfast UVF pledged to fight drug dealing on the Shankill. And while this should be seen as getting rid of dealers within their ranks versus getting rid of all dealers, they had largely succeeded in their efforts to sharpen their image in the eyes of the British government, with the West Belfast UDA shoddily attempting to come along for the ride. But progress is progress in the eyes of some. So to show the Loyalists their efforts were not for nothing, Westminster gave them exactly what they demanded in their 2020 Lambeth Palace meeting, when the UVF called for an end to historic prosecutions in exchange for winding down criminality.
The legislation we are bringing forward will implement a legally robust and effective information recovery process that will provide answers for families, uphold our commitments to those who served in Northern Ireland, and help society to look forward.
In late 2023, the controversial Northern Ireland Legacy Act was introduced across the province. The bill stopped New Troubles-era cases and inquests from starting, and offered conditional amnesty to those accused of killings, with total immunity to anyone who came clean about their crimes, before a newly established Truth Commission. The proposed goal of the Legacy Act was to prioritize truth over punishment, but in the eyes of many, it was seen as protecting perpetrators versus achieving any kind of justice for victims and survivors, with a high court ruling it a breach of human rights in February 2024, and King Charles even pledging to repeal the act months later in July. But to date, there has been no timeline put forth on repealing or replacing the controversial Legacy Act. And life is still life on the Shankill Road, where the U.D.A. and UVF are an afterthought for most residents, who would rather just get on with it than question why paramilitaries still need to exist. Because the truth is, the Shankill Road is not some war zone, but it does still have a very serious drug problem. Because while the UVF, and to a lesser extent the U.D.A., have made efforts to clean up their public image, the resulting decentralization of drug dealing has not gotten rid of drugs, but instead allowed for more independent dealers to get into the game, creating new challenges for law enforcement and the struggling communities they police on a daily basis. But if the West Belfast UDA can publicly say the drugs problem is just a C Company issue, that's a big win in terms of local community groups seeking government grants, even if the dogs in the street know how far it is from the truth. With every day that passes, the U.D.A. becomes more fractured and more unpredictable. But through it all, two men have survived. Jim Spence, who allegedly planned the murder of Pat Finucane, survived a deadly feud with Johnny Adair, and designed one of the most profitable and uninterrupted drug operations across 3 decades in Northern Ireland, had done it once again without firing a shot, retiring from his criminal empire at seemingly the perfect time, and ultimately moving to England. However, with the Pat Finucane inquest ordered by the UK government in September 2024, it is almost certain Jim Spence will be called back home to give testimony. But Mo Courtney, the one-time UFF hitman and allegedly one of the gunmen who murdered Pat Finucane, drove Alan McCullough to his death and rebuilt C Company in the uncertain aftermath of Johnny Adair, appears to be in it for the long haul, as he continues to oversee criminal operations into his 60s. But Spence and Courtney, the mind and the muscle, have managed to do one thing together, and that is survive at all costs. And for better or worse, they are two of the most significant figures within the modern Loyalist story, managing to keep a foot in the old school, a foot in the new, and always abiding by a common principle: no surrender.